Okay, good afternoon. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for coming. I'd like to thank Susan and Woody Register from Swanee for arranging this visit. It's been, last evening was just fascinating watching the film and the panel discussion, and so I feel very honored to be able to talk to you today. I think there's people in the room with different understandings of the Ed Johnson case. My talk is not actually about Ed Johnson. I'm going to be using the case as an example, but I'm going to be talking about the context of lynching. Tomorrow I'm going to be talking about the legacy of lynching, and Susan mentioned the parallels today to today's climate. So I'll be talking more about that in terms of memory and sort of the relationship between the past and the present. But what I want to do, since there might be people in the room with different understandings of this case, I do want to just give you a very, very brief summary of the case. Ed Johnson was an African-American man who was lynched here in Chattanooga in 1906 for allegedly raping a white woman named Nevada Taylor. He was tried in court, in county court, and he was convicted and sentenced to hang. And then two local African-American lawyers sought an appeal. They sought a new trial. And that request for an appeal made its way through the court system. They eventually went into the federal court system, and it made its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court granted him that appeal, which means that they had to put a stay on his execution. They had to hold his execution. And at that point, the mob in Chattanooga broke into the local jail. The sheriff had not fully secured the jail or had protected Johnson, and the mob abducted him from the jail and hanged him, or actually riddled him with bullets on the Walnut Street Bridge, which was a railroad bridge at the time. And the Supreme Court they were furious at this, and they ended up trying and convicting the sheriff, several of his deputies, and several members of the mob for contempt of court. So the Ed Johnson lynching in 1906 was atypical in many ways. That Johnson had advocates who cared to push for his appeal after his conviction. That was atypical. That he had two African-American lawyers investigating his case and handling that appeal. That was very atypical. That appeal went to the U.S. Supreme Court, who intervened. That was by issuing the stay of execution, which then led to the lynching. That was atypical. And that the court tried and convicted the sheriff and deputies in the mob for contempt of court, and that they did this to kind of send a message nationally about the importance of the rule of law. All of that was atypical. All of that was extraordinary, and as we were discussing last night, had significant legal implications about the application of the 14th Amendment and the relationships between federal courts and state courts. But what I want to do today is focus on all the ways that the Ed Johnson lynching was typical. Its setting in a growing urban environment in Chattanooga was typical, fairly typical. The white community's desire to maintain white supremacy at all costs was typical. The fact that the lynching was spurred by a supposed need to protect the purity of white womanhood and was defended in those terms was typical. And the widespread public sentiment in the white community that they were justified in circumventing the law to do so, that the law was, in their minds, an impediment or an obstacle to justice, was typical. So today I want to place the lynching of Ed Johnson in historical perspective by talking about the practice of lynching in the early 20th century, what caused lynching outbreaks, why lynching, what led white men and women to find these acts of extra-legal violence socially acceptable, and what meanings or messages did these acts of violence convey. And there's two main points that I'm going to be making today. One is that lynching in the Jim Crow era was a product, or lynchings were products of modern life. and they were reactions against modern life. They were not pre-modern as much as they were anti-modern. The primary cultural image of a lynching is that it was a rural backwoods practice. And this was a primary image that people at the time had of lynchings, that it was a holdover from frontier societies where legal institutions were weak or non-existent. But that was not quite the case for the majority of lynchings that took place in the Jim Crow South. Instead, as I said, lynchings were very much products of the modern South. This is how a new South city like Chattanooga could have a lynching in 1906. Lynch mobs made use of modern technologies, trains, telegrams, and telephones could widen, could expand the size of crowds. That Ed Johnson was lynched on a railroad bridge was not unusual. That members of the crowd in lynchings took photographs, which were sold in local stores, or were circulated, or made into postcards and sent to families and friends, which also further expanded the audience for lynching. So all these kind of modern elements that were part of lynching. I don't mean to say that all lynchings happened in cities like Chattanooga. That's not true. But even smaller towns were undergoing social change in this period. And I'm going to talk about what those changes were. Yet, at the same time, lynchings, as I say, products of modern life, but they were also a reactionary practice. They represented a desire to restore order at a time when people saw disorder, a desire to reinforce white supremacy at a time when it was considered unstable. And it was a reaction against principles of modern law and due process when the state, in the case of Ed Johnson, when the federal state was insisting upon them. So that's the first point, this relationship of lynchings to modern life. And second, the second point I want to make is that because lynchings were meant to reinforce white supremacy and the social order at times of change and instability, they needed to be performative and ritualistic. That even small lynchings that were conducted by just a few men outside of public view were performative and ritualistic. That is, they were spectacles, and they were spectacles for the benefit of whites. Now, lynching absolutely was about sending a message to African Americans about the consequences of challenging white supremacy and power in any way. They were meant to terrorize and intimidate. And in that sense, the intended victims of a lynching included more than the immediate victim. That lynchings were acts of terrorism perpetrated against black communities. But lynchings were also performed to send a message to whites, to white Southerners, about themselves. After all, the primary witnesses to a lynching were other whites. And lynchings imparted powerful messages to white communities about white domination and black subordination, about white power and black criminality that reinforced and reconstructed white supremacy as an ideology. So I'm going to kind of elaborate on those points, but first I want to give you just some general background on lynching. So the Jim Crow era in the South is commonly known as the quote-unquote lynching era. Commentators at the time called it that, and historians since have called the Jim Crow era the lynching era. Between 1880 and 1940 to World War II, well over 4,000 people were lynched across the country in every state in the country but 4. Now, it's hard to get an exact count of lynchings. It depends on how you're defining a lynching, and even then, any estimate is likely to be an undercounting, since there might be accounts out there that exist that historians have yet to see, and there were probably many lynchings that went unrecorded, especially in the 1880s and 1890s. But we can kind of come up with some general statistics here. About over 70% of lynchings were committed against African Americans. Other groups that were targeted include Mexicans, Native Americans, certain immigrants, and many native-born white men who had committed egregious crimes. But the vast majority of lynchings in the Jim Crow era were committed against African Americans and African American men more specifically. There are cases of African American women being lynched, but usually they were lynched because of their connection to a black male accused criminal. And the vast majority of lynchings in this time period, about close to 90%, happened in southern states. In the South, about 3,200 African American men were lynched between 1880 and 1940. And this is a map from the Tuskegee Institute, which was one organization that was tracking lynchings. It goes up to 1968, though I'll be focusing on the pre-World War II era. And these numbers, now historians have found more. These numbers are an undercounting. But I'm showing it anyway because I think the shading is what I want you to pay attention to, right? So this darker, these states here had the most lynchings. So you can kind of see geographically how lynching is playing out. The Equal Justice Initiative has an interactive map that records 5,000 lynchings nationwide going up through the 1960s. But I'm too technically inept to figure out how to get an interactive map into a PowerPoint, so I went with my old Tuskegee map. Lynchings didn't begin in 1880. We're using that as a marker of the beginnings of the Jim Crow era lynchings. But lynching dates back to, the term dates back to the 18th century. The practice dates back even farther than that. Most lynchings that were conducted before the Civil War were committed in what we call frontier regions, which is where we get the image of lynching as a kind of frontier practice. They were performed against other whites, against Mexicans and Native Americans, and in general it was more infrequent, largely because the population was smaller. Those pre-Civil War lynchings probably numbered in the hundreds rather than the thousands. And lynching wasn't a particularly Southern phenomenon before the Civil War. So as I said, it's being conducted in frontier regions. After the Civil War, lynching becomes a racialized phenomenon with African Americans as the primary targets. So with the emancipation of slavery, the institution of slavery no longer defined relationships between blacks and whites. The racial hierarchy and racial roles had become unsettled, and Reconstruction had given African Americans new civil and political rights. And there was tremendous white backlash to those changes during Reconstruction. Hundreds and hundreds of African Americans were killed in race riots and in lynchings in the years of Reconstruction, from the end of the war in 1865 to the withdrawal of federal troops in 1877. In fact, historians have found there were more lynchings committed during Reconstruction than in the height of the so-called lynching era of the 1890s and early 1900s. Lynchings were also on a sort of, they kind of reached a peak in 1890 and then they go on this kind of steady decline. And this, again, this is from the Tuskegee Institute numbers, but I think that, so don't pay attention too closely to the actual numbers, but the trends that they're showing are pretty accurate. You can see that in the 1880s, there are more whites, so the purple are whites. There are more whites being lynched than African Americans. So there was, after Reconstruction, there's this kind of dip in lynchings, and then in 1890s, lynching rises. By mid-1895, it's way up high, and the number of whites being lynched goes way down over time. That's it becoming a racialized process. So we see this uptick in the 1890s, and then there's this steady decline through the 20th century. So even by the 1920s, that there's this sharp decline. So the term lynching era to describe the Jim Crow period might be a misnomer. The Jim Crow period is known as the lynching era in part because there was more coverage of lynchings in this period. Various news agencies and civil rights organizations like the Tuskegee Institute began tracking lynchings, so we knew more about them. And newspapers began reporting on individual lynchings with more detail, which led Americans at the time to perceive lynching as a kind of new epidemic. In that sense, the very idea of the lynching era is a product of modern media, in some sense. There was also more attention paid to lynchings in the Jim Crow period because they were unexpected at this time, as opposed to right in the chaos of the aftermath of the Civil War. In the late 19th and early 20th century, that period was seen as a modern era to people living through it, seen as that we're in modern times now. And so lynching seemed anachronistic to them, so that's going to put more focus on them. But I don't want to get too hung up on numbers, because I'm mostly interested in Jim Crow lynchings as a cultural phenomenon. So Jim Crow lynchings usually occurred in response to a crime, a murder or attempted murder, or an assault on a white person, a rape or attempted rape on white women, theft or property crimes. They were also sometimes committed as an act of retaliation against an African American who posed an economic threat, so say a successful farmer or a successful businessman, or in some rural areas, white mobs targeted black laborers who posed a threat to white labor, that they're in economic competition with them. But those kinds of directly economically motivated lynchings were relatively rare. Most are in response to a crime. A good number of lynchings were public, like Ed Johnson's, that were done in public areas with crowds of people. Most of these public lynchings, or what historians call mass mob lynchings, happened when a heinous crime had been committed, a murder or a rape. But most lynchings were not public in that way. They were committed by smaller groups of men away from public view. But even private lynchings conducted by small mobs were, I'd argue, ritualistic and performative. They were cultural acts. And I see that as a kind of defining characteristic of a lynching, what differentiated a lynching from a murder. And then they were, as I said, made public with graphic news accounts or pamphlets, or as I said, photographs that were made and circulated. And they were meant to convey meaning in these ways. Okay, so that's a little background. I want to turn to sort of what caused this epidemic of lynching across the South. If lynching was a holdover from an earlier frontier practice, why was it still persisting in the modern era? And that has to do a lot with what was happening in this modern era of the South. There was tremendous amounts of upheaval happening across the South in the late 19th and early 20th century. There was industrialization, especially as northern capital was streaming into the South to rebuild the region after Reconstruction. And as railroads expanded across the region, connecting markets. Towns and cities were growing, and people, both black and white, were leaving farms and coming into towns and cities like Chattanooga for industrial work. Now, many citizens at the time were celebrating signs of progress. They called this the New South, rising from the ashes of the Civil War and Reconstruction. They welcomed the spread of industry and commerce. They welcomed the paving of streets, the electrification of streets, things like streetcars and railroads, and other indications of economic development. Yet, this process of modernization brought social changes that destabilized established norms, particularly racial norms. And these changes were deeply threatening. In rural areas, in rural settings, white supremacy was largely maintained through ingrained habits of racial deference, through the fact that if you were black, your white employer probably knew your father, your mother, his father employed or owned your grandfather, etc. But those informal kinds of relationships held little authority or held little sway in towns and cities or in industrial settings. In towns and cities, people regularly encounter, when I say towns and cities, Chattanooga would be a larger one, but this is even happening in smaller towns across the South. But people are regularly encountering strangers in their daily life. And their social status would be less known, it's less fixed. And interactions in stores and markets or on public transportation, you know, streetcars, railroads, or on sidewalks even, potentially could place whites and blacks on equal footing. Also interactions in places like bars or saloons, many of which had mixed race clienteles, like the bar that Ed Johnson was hanging out in the night that Nevada Taylor was assaulted, would be an example of that. So in this new environment of the modernizing South, African Americans came to expect the same legal and civil rights accorded to whites. This was especially the case for the first generation born after slavery, a generation, this first generation who were not born as slaves. And that generation comes of age in the 1890s. And that younger generation was much more likely to refuse to acquiesce to racial customs, to play the deferential role. And so they posed a particular threat to Southern whites. So at that time, white Southerners were in a process of reasserting their authority amid all these changes from the 1890s and beyond. They did this through the systematic disenfranchisement of African American men as they're rewriting their state constitutions in the 1890s. They did it through the establishment of racial segregation, which you start seeing the first segregation laws in the 1890s. In other words, Jim Crow regimes emerged from the disruptions of modern life, that urban life required that what had been sort of racial custom, that custom is codified into law in this period. And these same changes, I'd argue, provoked outbreaks of lynching. And one reason for this is that white Southerners tended to interpret the upending of traditional social patterns as signs of moral dissolution, as moral threats. We don't have precise statistics, but crime and vice were probably on the rise as towns and cities grew. Industries, as they're arising in the New South, brought young, unattached men of both races into towns and cities. And subsequently, you see the rise, and you can see this just looking, if you look at city directories over time, you see more bars, pool halls, dance halls, and brothels emerging, which then led to an increase in drinking, gambling, and other illicit behaviors, including violence. And these trends, and you see this again in all sort of public accounts, this is what people are talking about at the time. They're disturbing to respectable citizens of both races at the time. But white Southerners perceived these moral changes in highly racialized terms. They believed that they reflected what they considered innate black immorality, and even more so, black criminal tendencies. Stories of black crime proliferated in local newspapers, which then fueled white fears of a black crime wave. You can open any newspaper from a southern town of any size in this period, and there will be over and over again stories of black crime. And we see this in Chattanooga in 1905 and 1906, in the months leading up to the assault on Nevada Taylor. 3 other white girls or women had been attacked, and there had been a series of burglaries or other crimes reported. The white crime was the white community was already on edge when Taylor was assaulted, and that's very typical, right? So I was saying earlier to some students that most crimes with white victims and alleged black assailants went through the court system, right? So you have to think, like, what is the moment where a lynching is going to there's going to be an outbreak of lynching. It's always when there's you know, this fears of a crime wave, that the white community is already on edge. In the Jim Crow South, this fear of black crime was bound up with ideas of white supremacy. White Southerners, and I was saying this earlier today too, that white Southerners had long interpreted African Americans' demands for political and social equality in the most lurid terms possible. And this goes back to right before the Civil War and Reconstruction. They perceived threats to their social and political supremacy as threats to their personal safety. It was hard to disentangle them. African Americans, in their view, were primed to break into their homes, assault, and murder them. Or even worse, they believed that what African American men really wanted was not voting rights or civil equality, but miscegenation. That is, whites interpreted integration as physical integration, miscegenation, mixing of the races sexually, which could only entail, in their minds, taking white women by force. And that prospect threatened the entire edifice of white supremacy, the racial purity of the white race. And so the protection of white homes, white lives, and above all, white women from menacing black criminals or black brutes or black beasts, or put that in quotations, the language that they use, that becomes the end goal of white supremacy. And it also becomes the primary justification for lynching. Now, most lynch mobs acted in response to non-sexual assaults on whites, attempted murder or murder. Only about 1/4 to 1/3 of lynchings were in retaliation for rape or attempted rape. But the defenses of lynching, the way lynching was discussed in the South, focused on rape, because the rape of the white woman struck such a chord. The crime of rape, when committed by black men against white women, particularly horrified white Southerners because it was considered an assault not only on white women's purity and thus the purity of the white race, but white men's authority to protect and control that purity. In other words, it was seen as an attack on a white woman, was seen as an attack on white masculine dominance. So lynching to white men was more than just a legitimate response to crime. They saw it as a kind of masculine, patriarchal duty. And this duty crossed class lines. It offered men of different social standing a degree of authority in the face of this kind of profound social instability that's happening. Rape remained a capital crime, subject to the death penalty in many southern states through the Jim Crow era. And it was very rare for a white man to be executed for rape. It was a punishment pretty much reserved for alleged black rapists, with some exceptions like white male pedophiles, for instance. Lynch mobs, we'll talk about class, social class for a second. Lynch mobs crossed class lines. Lynchings often occurred with the tacit, if not explicit, support of social elites. We can see that. We see that in the Ed Johnson case. The public perception is often that mobs were comprised of kind of poor, economically struggling men who were in direct economic competition with black men. And that's not quite. As I said, economically motivated lynchings were rare. The best we can tell, and this is from research based on when members of the mob are named in grand jury investigations or sometimes NAACP investigations, the best we can tell, mobs were mostly comprised of what we call middle class or lower middle class white citizens. Very often yeoman farmers who owned their own land, so not farm laborers, people who own their own land, but also very often men who were part of this New South economy and who benefited from this New South economy. craftsmen or skilled laborers, salesmen, managers, small shopkeepers, mechanics, men who held solidly white occupations and in no direct economic competition with African Americans. And we see this in the lynching of Ed Johnson. The result of the Justice Department's investigation listed 16 men as responsible for the lynching, along with Sheriff Shipp and his deputies. And 6 of those 16 men were found guilty. For the others, there was not enough evidence so their cases were dismissed because witnesses refused to come forward, or many witnesses were intimidated from testifying. But the occupations of those men here in Chattanooga include several saloon keepers, a proprietor of a cleaning company, a grocery store owner, so small businessmen, a painter, a carpenter, and a machinist, skilled laborers, a manager at a meat market, a bartender, right? So that's that kind of middle class, lower middle class class group. Yet, even though the men in this class group were not necessarily struggling economically, they didn't feel socially secure in their positions. They differ from the lawyers, the planters, the industrial elite. These were commonly men on the rise. Many of them are transplants from rural areas, or they're laborers climbing the class ranks, but whose standing as kind of respectable middle-class citizens was not yet firmly established. They were deeply invested in maintaining a strict racial hierarchy and securing their social status as white men at this time. So in these ways, white authority for many people was not a kind of stable or fixed entity, or kind of stable or fixed thing at this time. White supremacy has been, of course, very long-lasting in the United States, but its tenor and its features have changed over time to meet new social and political conditions. And it was actually, at this time, a very fragile ideology. We think of the Jim Crow era as when white supremacy was, not fragile at all, but if it weren't fragile, you wouldn't need Jim Crow laws, right? So it was a fragile ideology that required constant reconstruction and reinforcement. And the late 19th century posed a particular challenge, since Reconstruction had introduced the possibility of social and political equality for African Americans. White Democrats, when they had come back into power after Reconstruction, had swiftly sought to reestablish their political power. But there was still a lot of political flux in that time. Sort of the codification of racial segregation was happening in fits and starts through the 1880s and 1890s, and really kind of clamps down in the 1890s. African American men were still voting and holding office in places, in certain localities throughout the 1880s. There was a populist movement where some populists were hoping to form interracial alliances to challenge the power of planter and industrial elites. So there was a lot of class tension, and white Southerners were hardly a unified community at the turn of the century. Many planters and industrial elites started using white supremacy or white solidarity politically. One historian has called them white solidarity and white supremacy as useful political slogans that were meant to unite whites along racial lines to suppress any class revolt at the time. And many poor and middle class white men embraced white supremacy as a means to claim authority for themselves amid all of this social disruption that the New South had created. So lynching rituals provided another means through which white supremacy was reconstructed. Rituals of mob violence did more than simply reflect or represent white supremacy. Rather, I'd argue that the performance of a lynching and its subsequent reproduction in news reports, in pamphlets, in photographs, and postcards, helped to forge a sense of white superiority and unity across class lines, as well as across other kinds of divisions, like geographical divisions, country, town, for instance, or generational, young and old. And this is why the ritual and performance of a lynching were important. They didn't just convey a message about white supremacy, they reenacted white supremacy. They brought it to life. They allowed people to attach themselves to it as a system of ideas. And you can see that in the narratives of lynching, that the rhetoric surrounding lynching and lynching defenses, and I want to kind of turn and focus a little bit on these lynching narratives. Narrative accounts of lynching, if you start reading them across the South, and even in areas where lynchings are happening in the North, they're remarkably similar. They just start all sounding alike. Now the term mob, we talk about a mob, it usually suggests an unruly or irrational crowd, right? It's usually not seen as a positive term. Yet pro-lynching narratives represented mobs, which they sometimes called posses or groups of men. They represented them as orderly and restrained, working with kind of methodical deliberation. The men who comprised them were always deemed respectable and reputable, fulfilling their civic duty. And I'm going to give you one example. This is an example from the 1902 lynching, so 4 years before Ed Johnson, of Walter Allen, an African-American man in Rome, Georgia, which is about 70 miles south of here. And Allen was lynched for allegedly assaulting a 15-year-old white girl on the sidewalks of Rome. And the local news account wrote that the mob was composed of citizens of high and low degree, without regard to friendships, politics, or social standing. The mob was not a wild or frenzied crowd at all, but grim and determined, and they worked quietly in an orderly manner. That's so typical. Here's from the Chattanooga News after the lynching of Ed Johnson, and I find this one particularly interesting because of the first line. Like wild beasts for a moment, the crowd circled the Negro in their midst, but about him stood determined men, that word determined, determined men whose plan of action seemed to have been mapped out long before, and who seemed determined that no hitch should occur in their arrangement. So it starts out with this imagery of the irrational, animal-like crowd or mob, but then switches, right? And it goes back into that language that you see in other reports, and ultimately it's Johnson who's the beast who's circled, right? Reports also focused on the diversity of the mobs and spectators, that they included men from different occupations. You see that in the Rome, Georgia report, men of high and low station, men from town and country. Oftentimes if women and children were there, they would note that. And they did that to represent the crowd as a united, cohesive group, that they were a physical manifestation of the political concept of white solidarity. These narratives of a united crowd then legitimized the pro-lynching defense that mobs represented a collective white interest, and that the crime avenged was a crime against not only a particular victim, but all white citizens. And then they also serve this additional purpose of, absolving members of the mob, right, of any individual responsibility for their lynching, right? Like, oh, women and children were there, that makes it acceptable. These reports also represented the alleged black criminal in very common ways. He was always a beast, a brute, or a fiend. You see those three words repeated over and over and over again. And you see that in the accounts, if you read accounts of Ed Johnson. From the time of the assault of Nevada Taylor to his death, Johnson is referred to over and over and over again as a beast or a brute. And depictions of these kind of quote-unquote black brutes subdued by the very composed, determined, forceful white citizenry, that bolstered the core beliefs of white supremacy. Accounts commonly recorded the victim's behavior at the time of capture and death, and regardless of how he behaved, his actions condemned him. So if he screamed, or he cried, or he pleaded for mercy, all of those were read as signs of his fundamental weakness and his lack of self-control or self-mastery. So his frenzy then stood in opposition to the control and power of the crowd of white men, and also justified their violence against him. Alternatively, if the lynching victim remained calm and stoic, his composure became evidence of his fundamental brutishness, and his, like, something must be wrong with him. He doesn't even seem to care that he's about to die. Or, you know, his degradation or his subordination. And we see this, this is the description from the Chattanooga News when Ed Johnson is being led out of his cell in the jail. Johnson held his head in the same lowly position which is now known as characteristic of the Negro, and went along with the mob with his lips tight closed and his eyes downcast. So he is, he's basically, Johnson is enacting his subservience right here. And that's sort of evidence of white supremacy. In both cases, whether the victim is represented as in a frenzy or calm and subservient, he's depicted as entirely isolated and alone, as opposed to the crowd of white men who are united together. Now, I'd argue that these kinds of accounts that are written after the events are not secondary events, that they're an integral part of the lynching ritual and spectacle, that they bestowed meaning onto the violence, and they imparted messages about the legitimacy and the moral righteousness of the ritual. And as I said, they also expanded the witnesses of a lynching, allowing citizens who were not present to be able to partake in this ritual and attach themselves to these core beliefs of white supremacy. So I want to kind of end with looking at the relationship between lynching and the law and capital punishment, which of course, I'm not going to go into the exceptions of the Ed Johnson case, but I want to look at, again, what was kind of typical about the Ed Johnson case. The defense of lynching was predicated on the assumption that mob violence, though extra-legal, outside the law, was a legitimate expression of justice. Lynch mobs and their defenders did not necessarily reject principles of law, and the social acceptability of lynching did not indicate an absence of modern legal principles of due process. In other words, lynching was not simply a kind of pre-modern practice conducted in frontier or backwoods areas where modern legal institutions were not yet established. Instead, mobs engaged in vigilante violence against modern principles of law, very consciously against them, which they considered these modern principles of law as too abstract, too deliberative to redress the enormity of certain crimes. In their view, the legal process worked too slowly and was overly careful to protect the rights of defendants. Certain crimes, in their view, that disturbed the racial order were too egregious to be handled through the courts, that black defendants didn't deserve due process. They instead advocated for what was called, or has been called, rough justice, that communities have the right, even the duty, to avenge crimes committed against them, and they could do so with an immediacy and a mercilessness that the modern law denied them. Rough justice is often also sometimes called local sovereignty, and it goes back before the Civil War even. But in the Jim Crow South, this concept of rough justice or local sovereignty had this racial element to it. And again, we see this in the Ed Johnson cases, that mobs in these cases saw themselves as acting not as lawless vigilantes, but as upholders of the law, that the law has failed them. So they're going to uphold higher principles of justice. So for instance, this is 2 quotes about the Ed Johnson lynching. This is the editor of the Chattanooga News saying, "I hold the worthless, shiftless, criminal black brute," that word, "who outrages a white woman has no more rights under the law than a serpent." Right? So you committed this particularly horrible crime, you don't deserve modern principles of law or due process. This is the Atlanta News talking about the Chattanooga lynching afterwards. And they said, "We do not believe in lynching or anarchy, but we do believe in the white men of the South protecting at any cost the white women when the courts fail to do so. In the case in Chattanooga, the crime was especially brutal and inhumane. The people of that city were justified in punishing the guilty Negro when they saw he might escape justice by the unwarranted delay and technicality of the courts." Here's another example. This is from the lynching of Henry Smith in 1893 in Paris, Texas. Henry Smith was an African-American man who was burned to death by a mob for the, he was accused of murdering the 3-year-old white daughter of a local police officer. And notice here the mob constructed a gallows and they wrote "justice" on the gallows. And the father of the little girl, who, as I said, was a police officer, took part, he participated, even though he was a police officer, he participated in this. So they see themselves as enacting justice. They don't see themselves as lawless at all. And you can also see in the Ed Johnson case, but even here in the constructing of the gallows, that lynching operated alongside capital punishment. In the case, as you see in the case of Ed Johnson, it was often viewed as a legitimate substitute for an execution when the state was working too slow or denying the community the right to participate in that execution. Now, scholars have not found a direct correlation between lynching and execution, that one served as a functional replacement for the other. It's hard to make that argument. There's no evidence that as lynchings declined, executions rose or vice versa. States with high execution rates also had high lynching rates. But in terms of cultural perceptions, citizens linked the two. And again, we see this in the case of Ed Johnson. Johnson was lynched because the white citizens of Chattanooga wanted to see him executed for his crime. If his execution had not been stayed, he would not have been lynched. You see that in the Atlanta News quote. And we also see that the line that separated an execution from a lynching was very thin. Although he had a trial, there was no due process, and if it were not for the intervention of the 2 African-American lawyers, Noah Pardon and Stiles Hutchins, the execution would have happened immediately after the trial with no chance for appeal. Now, I don't know that whether or not, maybe someone else does, but I don't know whether if the execution of Ed Johnson had gone through, whether it would have been a public execution. But the tradition of public execution also helps explain the mindset of the lynch mob. If we want to know how people in this time period thought it was socially acceptable to watch someone die, we have to look at this tradition of public execution, of what it meant to them. Now, the practice of lynching in the Jim Crow South coincided with the decline of legal public executions. Public executions at which the condemned was executed before a crowd of hundreds, was a long tradition in Europe and in the United States. In the United States, local sheriffs oversaw these events, and the ability to witness the death of the condemned was viewed as a community's prerogative. Political elites supported, through most of the 19th century, they supported public executions because they hoped that they would serve as a form of deterrence against crime. But through the 19th century, states began abandoning the practice of public executions. First, by having sheriffs enclose the gallows, put curtains around the gallows, or put fences around the gallows, and eventually, with the introduction of the electric chair in the 1890s, by moving executions to state penitentiaries. So taking authority over executions away from sheriffs and placing them in the hands of the state. The rationale behind this shift was that public hangings were not conveying the proper lesson to spectators, that instead elites felt that they were stimulating the most brutal impulses of the crowd, so rather than encouraging social order through deterrence, that public executions might be producing social disorder. Now, the shift away from public executions happens nationwide in the 19th century. But southern states underwent this shift later than states in the North and Midwest. Those states had outlawed public executions in the 1840s, and they had completed the transition by the late 19th century. Southern states, though, didn't begin to abolish public hangings until the late 19th century, and the practice continued in some places well into the 20th century. The very last public execution in this country happened in 1936. The lifetime of maybe some of you here or your parents or grandparents. And that happened in Kentucky. It was an African-American man who was convicted of rape of a white woman. When sheriffs, counties, and then states began making this shift away from public execution, the public vigorously resisted it across the country. They tore down enclosures and fences that protected the gallows from public view. They climbed rooftops and fences to catch a glimpse, and they begged and bribed sheriffs to be let in. And they didn't do so just out of morbid curiosity, but because they considered witnessing an execution a public right. It's a means through which their desire for vengeance was satisfied. They would not view it the way we view it, as kind of gross and unseemly, right? So the tradition of the public execution explains in part why mobs felt justified in performing a lynching, and they often performed lynchings in ways that mimicked legal executions. They appropriated many of the rituals from executions in the lynching, such as declarations of guilt and solicitations of confessions from the condemned. And doing that conferred legitimacy upon the lynching, right? If they're mimicking the legal execution, then they could see what they're doing as having legal legitimacy. The mob that lynched Ed Johnson impelled Johnson. They wanted Johnson to confess before killing him. And Johnson refuses to confess, which then sends the mob into kind of a further frenzy. But you have to ask, if they're already convinced that he's the culprit, why did they need him to confess? And the answer, I'd say, is that at that moment, they're clinging to a tradition that made sense to them, because that tradition of the condemned, before he's hanged, a minister comes up and he is expected to give a speech and offer his confession to the crime. And then if you see the kind of other rituals at lynching, from larger lynchings with, if there were lots of spectators, the taking of photographs, the collecting of souvenirs, all of those are carryovers from public hangings and public executions. So in that way, lynch mobs and lynching spectators reacted against the transformations of modern life by resorting to traditional practices and norms. In that way, they were anti-modern. So in the Ed Johnson case, the federal court's intervention, the delay on the execution, enraged the white community of Chattanooga, because it meant that this external, abstract entity, the federal U.S. Supreme Court, was intervening in what people considered their local sovereignty, their right and imperative as a community to control crime, to see crime avenged, and to maintain white supremacy in their localities, in their communities. I don't think Sheriff Shipp let this lynching happen only because he was up for re-election. I think he himself was very invested in this, because he assumed that there would be a trial. In the first attempt, there's a first attempt where the mob tries to break into the jail before Johnson's trial, and at that point the sheriff protects Johnson, and he sends him to Knoxville for protection. And he does that because he assumes there's going to be a trial, and that the community would then be able to enact and exact vengeance while maintaining law and order. But when the Supreme Court intervenes, he's furious, as was the judge in the original case, Judge Reynolds. For them, it was, as I said, a slap in the face of what they considered their sovereignty over crime control in their city. that the white people of Chattanooga deserved justice, and now this distant court would deny it to them on abstract principles of due process and equality under the law, principles that flew in the face of white supremacy. And again, we see that in the Atlanta News quote. So he was all too happy to let the mob take Johnson away, and Reynolds, who watched the whole scenario from the courthouse window, was all too happy to watch. So, to sort of sum this up, despite the extraordinary events surrounding the lynching of Ed Johnson and its impact on legal history, which is incredibly important, the mindset that led to this lynching was entirely typical. The lynching of Ed Johnson was a reactionary ritual to modern encroachments, new social arrangements, to vice and crime in Chattanooga, and modern law that challenged traditional norms, most particularly a challenge to white supremacy. And so the ritual of lynching, in turn, reestablishes community order, justice, and that supremacy. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We have time for questions and answers. And there's one hand went up right away, all the way in the back.
I have 2 questions.
Okay.
You know, I ain't gonna do you like that. I have 1 question. I want to know, what do you hope to accomplish by going to schools telling them about the research of lynching?
Well, what do I hope to? You sound like you're skeptical, that you don't think it's going to accomplish anything.
Oh, it's accomplishing something. I just want to know what you are trying to get out of it.
Well, I'm a historian. I'm a historian by training, so I believe that history matters, and I believe that history is important, and I don't believe that we can understand ourselves as a society, as a nation, without understanding our history. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be in the profession I'm in, right? As a historian, I don't just write for myself. I write for other historians, and we hope to shape how our country understands its history. So that's what I hope to accomplish. The writing of history, understanding. Do you have a follow-up?
No, I just asked the same question. Because we didn't talk about history as a whole. We talked about lynching. So,
Oh, you want to know more specifically what?
yeah.
Because I see this history as crucial to the history of our country. That I don't see this as an African American history. I see this as American history. That we cannot understand what's happening today in terms of race without understanding the history of racism and white supremacy in this country. And lynching is an important component of that. What would our, I think that, what would it mean if Americans didn't know that slavery had happened? What would that mean for our country if they didn't know that Jim Crow had happened? How would we, how do we possibly go forward in understanding public policy in the present without understanding how history has shaped the policy that we do have?
I enjoyed this. I want to thank you for presenting it. My question is, and I really don't know how to formulate it, but as I was listening to your lecture, what was going through my mind is there a counter lecture to inform the public of the crimes that black men were lynched for were also being committed by white men to black women.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yes.
the white community thought the crime was justifiable for lynching.
Mm-hmm.
But it was occurring also, the reverse was also occurring. So I'm wondering, do you incorporate, not you personally,
Do
but in
historians.
the historical realm, is
Absolutely.
the reverse incorporated to inform the public?
There's a number of great books on the experience of black women in the Jim Crow South, and as well as during Reconstruction, and as well as under slavery and the sexual exploitation of black women.
But you would have to read the books. In
Yeah.
forums like this, do you ever incorporate
Um,
that experience into your presentation?
Yes, if I had time, and if you know, it depends on what the sort of the subject or topic of the talk were, right? So if I were going to focus on, you know, the history, the history of rape and sexuality, then yeah, you can't tell that story without telling the story of the experience of African American women. And you know, when I talk about sort of white men having this sense of authority over white women, and that's their sort of fear of why why rape strikes such a chord with them, you have to look at the ways in which they're not offering those same protections to African American women, nor are they allowing African American men that same prerogative to avenge. Absolutely, yeah, that's.
Because I would surmise that many audience members, I'm not saying this audience,
Mm-hmm.
but in public forums, by hearing that side, they would leave thinking that lynching was justified,
Oh, I hope not.
or mob rule was justified
Yeah.
because of the crime. Because the crime was used to justify it. So if you don't tell the reverse of what was happening, they're leaving with one perception. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I understand what you say. I would not want anyone to come away with the impression that this is, you know, my sense about it is I've often had students ask me, you know, well, you know, did these men actually do it? In the case of Ed Johnson, there's a lot of evidence that he was innocent. You know, but I get asked a lot that, well, you know, if I'm talking about another lynching, well, did he actually do it? And my answer to that is, one, we can never know because there was no due process, right? There's no real investigation and there's no fair trial to actually ascertain truth. And then the second thing I say is it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter because lynching, regardless of the crime, regardless of guilt or innocence, we're supposedly a nation of law and the rule of law and due process. You know, we can't operate as a civil society through mob rule and vigilante justice. So now I would hope that no one would come away with that idea.
I hope not, but if both sides are not presented, they might.
Yeah.
That was my point.
Yeah.
If I may, I'd like to add just a few things. There is a recent history that has emerged to actually address the sexualized violence that Black women experienced throughout, especially through slavery and past Reconstruction. And I think what you're getting at is, in fact, the silence within the record. There are no scripts of the kinds of accusation that what motivated and how white men's violence was justified. Those scripts simply don't exist because, and that's deliberate. There was no context, there was no press. Now, the Black press certainly did address some of that violence, and there is a history that is, and it's largely a beginning. There's a lot more work to be done. So I think that silence, in fact, was part of the spectacle, right, to silence that side, that violence, that there was no legal record. That was deliberate. It was part of that construct of white supremacy. Other questions?
How does the Ku Klux Klan fit into this picture?
So the Ku Klux Klan arises during Reconstruction as a kind of a group that basically set out to engage in political terrorism, to intimidate and harass African American Republicans during Reconstruction. And they were engaging in all sorts of forms of terror and violence and lynchings. They disband as an organization. They're pretty much disbanded formally by 1872. There's sort of smaller Ku Klux groups through the late 19th century, but there's no formal Ku Klux Klan. in that period. And they don't rise again as a formal organization until 1915. They're resurrected in Georgia in 1915. And then they become a national organization across the country, and they targeted not only African Americans, but a lot of immigrants. So they were an anti-Catholic group. They were a nativist organization touting white American Protestantism. And they, as an organization, denounced lynchings. But surely the very men who joined the Klan would have been the same kind of men who were part of these lynch mobs. So we can't find evidence, right, hard evidence that that the Klan is engaging in lynchings. But certainly we can surmise that these are the same kinds of men. And then that's called the Second Klan. That disbands by the late 1920s, and then it gets resurrected again in the 1950s, and then you do see the Klan engaging in civil rights murders and other forms of violence in the civil rights era.
Thank you. It was a fascinating talk. I found this question of what you hope to accomplish interesting, and one thing that struck me was it seems to me that you are writing against a sort of common perception of lynchings as unruly mobs operating on frontiers. And I'm wondering if you can delve to how that narrative came to be, given how overwhelming the evidence is that these were orderly, urban, modern. When was it that, as Americans, we came to regard them as this other thing? Did that happen immediately?
So part of that idea of, well, lynching's just a hangover from the kind of frontier justice. You see that in the early 20th century, and then you see it in the first historians who were writing about lynching. And it was also a way for Southern elites, once they, on Wednesday I'm going to be talking more about anti-lynching activists and the NAACP and the black press. Not Wednesday, tomorrow, Tuesday. I'm mixing up my days. But it was a way for Southern elites, once they're on the defensive about lynching, to discount it, right? To say, this isn't our towns that are doing these. These are just some hicks from outside. And that, but then you also see some scholars in, like the 1920s and 1930s taking up that view. And the idea that these are just poor whites who are just economically struggling, that continued to be a common view. You see historians even repeating that in the 1970s, 1980s. So yeah, you're right, that's part of what I'm trying to argue against. But my other I'm a cultural historian, so the other kind of approach I'm taking is to look at these as cultural events and to kind of tease out their meanings.
There are a couple of, all the way in the back, and then.
What do you think was different about the 4 states that didn't have lynchings?
The 4 states were Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. They're New England states. They were, very progressive. They also had very few African Americans in them, so they had a small black population. But even, like Vermont and Maine had a lynching, but they had lynched a white man. These states were, they're progressive states. They tend to be more, educated people who are going to uphold principles of law and justice. So it's not a surprise that it's those 4 New England states.
So you discussed how local papers and media tended to reinforce the narrative of white supremacy in the context of lynchings. My question is kind of, to what extent did the news coverage inform and or shape the narrative itself? Was the coverage usually just an afterthought of lynchings, or is there evidence to show that the coverage spurred on more racial violence? Was there any sort of source of counter-narrative?
So I think there's a couple questions in there. So I think the coverage of lynchings, as I said, I don't see them as secondary events. I see them as part of the ritual through which the community legitimizes what they've done. Are they shaping? I think that, you see, across the South, very different areas, you see the very same kinds of rituals, right? And this is pre-television. So, and pre-internet. So when you see, and people aren't traveling as much as they are now. So when you see, a lynch mob in Arkansas, behaving in the same way as a lynch mob in Florida and behaving in the same way as a lynch mob up in Minnesota, where are they learning this, right? And so that's one of the questions I set out to him. Where are they getting this? And one is I think they're drawing from longer traditions like public executions, but I think that coverage played a role, that they're reading news accounts, and this is going to seep in. And I don't mean it in the way that they read, someone's going to read a news account and say, yeah, we want to go and do this. But I mean that they kind of seep in and they kind of create a script so that when a community is sort of feeling like, oh, we need to go and commit a lynching, they have a script. There were counter-narratives, and I'm going to talk about those on tomorrow, because you start seeing African-American journalists like John Mitchell and Ida B. Wells creating counter-narratives in the 1890s, and then the black press like the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier and the NAACP creating counter-narratives. I'm going to talk about those tomorrow, because they essentially flip the script.
Starting. Go ahead.
To what degree do you think modern technology is simply replacing lynching?
How do you mean?
Use of guns.
Oh, well, they were using guns back then.
But a lot of people are being handled
Oh, you mean
violently outside of the court system still.
Yes, yeah. Police killings, you mean? Yeah. I think that the impulse.
Or one neighbor killing another neighbor.
Vigilantism, yeah. I think that I'm gonna talk about this tomorrow. I'm a little wary of sort of drawing direct lines. I think history is there's too much flux and change in history to sort of say these are the same. That's the same as this, right? But certainly we can see some common, fears about black crime justifying certain kinds of violence. That still exists, and that goes back to this history. And she's left now, but to answer the young woman's question, right? We can't understand that. We can't understand the Black Lives Matter movement and why there's this protest without understanding this history of lynching. Otherwise, you're just looking at that movement in a vacuum, right? And I think the idea that that certain crimes, that there's this kind of frustration with the court systems that a lot of people feel, and that frustration with the court system is also heavily racialized. That I think that still exists now. I think, yeah, absolutely, you can draw different parallels.
Okay, this is just kind of an observation or a question. When you look at, or have you ever looked at, you have lawyers in the South at that time that knew that everyone deserved a fair trial, and they are compliant with this mob. And then I'm just curious what, the knowing that the law is there in place, we are a nation of laws, and the Southern lawyer or the Southern legal system is kind of turning a blind eye, right? We're not looking at it. When does that start to shift? Are there still divisions of that in this country where there's still, even though there's okay, that's how we do it here. I don't know, it's like the localism of law, but they've all read the same Constitution, right? They've all studied it. So have you ever looked at that? Like, it's kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, I've only looked at it as a citizen, right?
Yeah.
I'm a historian who studies pre-World War II, so I don't, I haven't studied. But yeah, I mean, I could make the same observation that you could, sort of studying the present, of, what, there's, and these, lawyers and judges in the Jim Crow South would pay lip service to rule of law and order was their term, right? And at the same time, also believing, well, sometimes crimes are so egregious that African Americans don't deserve that, or I'm giving them due process. They have a jury trial, even though it's an all-white jury. They have their own prejudice and biases where they just don't see that as a problem, right? right? Judge Reynolds didn't see that as a problem. And they were absolutely white. I mean, it was very hard to be a white Southerner and not be a white supremacist, not be racist at that time. They believed there's a superior race, and that, well, we can't have African Americans on the jury. They're not equipped to be on a jury. So that's, you know, that's blinding them as well. In terms of today, you know, I think that there's, you would see a lot of white law enforcement paying lip service to, of course we treat black defendants the same way we do white defendants. But when it actually comes on the ground, it's not happening.
Yeah, thank you for a really interesting talk. I know that you're a historian, but I do want to probe you a little more on contemporary context that you've already spoken about a little bit. I guess what I'm intrigued about is that the era that you're discussing, the spectacle that gets constructed around lynching is sort of acts in the service of particular white supremacy. So like there's a desire to make these things very visible. Whereas in a contemporary context, I guess my perception is that the same structures of white supremacy are reinforced by making things invisible, the same sorts of things that were at the time rendered so much of a spectacle. And now it's movements like Black Lives Matter that are actually trying to move things into this realm of spectacles. So do you have any thoughts about what inaugurated that shift, or when?
That's what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. I'm going to talk about when the spectacle goes underground. It's exactly what I'm going to talk about. Yeah, it happens in the 1930s and 40s, where it becomes a kind of regional embarrassment, and it has everything to do with anti-lynching activism. That anti-lynching activists essentially they keep the spectacle going, and they broadcast this nationwide, and they do so by, as I said, flipping the script. They change the commentary on it. And so that Southern whites still are committing violence, but they have to do it, as you said, invisibly, right? And that shift happens mid-20th century. Now you do see, you know, there's certainly the civil rights cases, there's burning of crosses, that's happening in the civil rights era. But the men who lynched Emmett Till did not do so publicly, right? And that's a shift. So the violence is still there.
Yeah, I was thinking about that case because it's his family that makes the choice.
It's his mother who makes it visible. Yeah, his mother turns makes the lynching photograph in that case. That's flipping it around. Yeah, it's exactly what I'm. Yeah.
We have room for one more question, and then I would like to introduce LaFrederick Thirkill, who would like to speak a little bit about the Ed Johnson project. And actually, I would like to, for Tracy Poole to mention, there's going to be a tour of the Ed Johnson history this week, the 24th.
Walnut Street Bridge on Monday, 24th at noon, and the Ed Johnson project historian from there is going to lead the tour, and the public is invited.
What day again?
It's Monday the 24th.
Monday the 24th, there will be a tour of the walking bridge where this lynching occurred, and I invite all of you who remain curious about some other aspects of this particular lynching, but certainly also to think about the local history and the public space that we cross the walking bridge all the time, and we may not necessarily think about it. So I think this is an important step. If there aren't any questions remaining, I'd like for LaFrederick Thirkill to come up front and say a little bit about the Ed Johnson project.
I want to say thank you first to UTC and Dr. Wood for the presentation tonight. I'm LaFrederick Thirkill, and I started learning about the Ed Johnson story about 18 years ago. And since then have been working to help tell this story, because in many cases I don't believe that things have changed. I don't believe things have ceased. I don't believe that the era of lynchings has ended. It's changed. It's being done differently. And so our goal is to continuously bring light to the Ed Johnson story as we help people continue to reflect on ways to improve racial relations through conversations and through dialogue that helps us focus on strategies that we can use to improve life in America or around the world. And so I want to just acknowledge some of the Ed Johnson committee members, if you'll raise your hand or stand, and so that they'll know who you are. I want to acknowledge also, without going any further, that Dr. Lawrence Thirkill, his grandson is here. His name is Steve Thirkill, and Steve, you'll stand and wave. And so I wanted to acknowledge him, being that we're in this hall. But again, just knowing that through this committee, we've worked on a project, and the project is threefold, part of which is Linda's work in helping to create the documentary for Ed Johnson, and part of my work has been through writing the play, Dead Innocent, the Ed Johnson story, and developing a scholarship that serves students who are in their sophomore year, majoring in the field of criminal justice and housed at the Community Foundation. So we're continuously raising money for that. The third part of the project is to have a memorial erected at the south end of the Walnut Street Bridge that focuses on three parts. It focuses on the story of Ed Johnson. It focuses on the work of the attorneys and talks about their life. And we also specialize or talk about the impact that the case had on the American justice system. And the person who's been identified, or that we've selected to help erect this memorial is Jerome Meadows, and he's standing in the back there at the top. And so we're delighted to know that we can make this a part of Chattanooga's history that continues that dialogue in finding ways that we can ensure that the tragedy that happened to Ed Johnson doesn't happen here locally again. And I think that this is one of our ways in helping to correct this injustice, but also help to remember the life of Ed Johnson and to help others learn, as you've come today to learn about it, but to know about it as you walk the Walnut Street Bridge. Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us tonight and listening to Dr. Wood's talk. If you have any questions, I'm sure she'll be available for a little bit hereafter. Again, we in the African American Studies program have a few more plans for the semester. If you're interested in learning more about the events, please, there's a sign-up sheet here in front. My name is Dr. Susan Eckelman. I think I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning, as it were. I'm the Director of Africana Studies. If you have questions about the program, certainly, or interest in the event program, just email me. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.